So good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Andrea Leers to lecture here tonight at the GSD. Andrea, as a lot of us will agree, is a very special architect and person. And for me personally, I think I met her when I sort of joined the GSD, and she was incredibly generous with her time in helping me make the transition. She had been the director of the urban design program, and I think sharing her insights about the culture at the GSD, a place that she's been so actively involved with for over a decade, was very, very useful, and I really appreciated that generosity. But I think what we really ought to celebrate is the special combination of her success both as a practitioner and a teacher. As a practitioner, Andrea is the co-founder of a firm with Jane Weinzapfel. Their firm's been based in Bombay and done a range of really interesting and more... Oh, sorry. What did I say? What did I say? Oh, I'm sorry, Boston. And I'm sorry. Yes, I know. Actually, I met Andrea first in Bombay, so that legitimizes this, yes. I've done a range of really interesting and, more importantly, complex and challenging projects in the city and elsewhere in the United States. I think the work of a firm lies at the intersection of architecture, urban design, and infrastructure, and brings to bear a sensitivity, both in terms of a sense of history as well as in its response to the urban context that they're building in. They've often taken on really unexpected and gritty programs, power plants, maintenance facilities, and converted them into beautiful buildings. But most importantly, their contribution is in building in the public domain, really where our craft makes the greatest impact. And the presence of the firm's work and projects I think really are visible. I think for all of us in this room, it's rather amazing that in just this vicinity, there's significant projects. The expansion of the Harvard Science Center, for example, in addition to CERT's building, was no easy task. The reconversion of the historic Hasty Pudding into the new Harvard Theater, again, is a significant project. And the office building on Mount Auburn Street behind the Holyoke Center is another challenge in a historic context. And these are already three significant commissions on the campus, and they're both sort of challenged by the fact that in these historic landscapes and these buildings have been inserted rather skillfully into this sort of existing built condition and a sort of infrastructure for the university at one level, not to mention the complexity this must have involved in terms of the bureaucracy that they dealt with and that they resisted to skillfully make these pieces of good architecture, and that's truly commendable. A recent important building in our vicinity somewhat is the Museum of Medical History that the firm has just completed at the Mass General Hospital. You can't miss it as you drive into the hospital complex, and the beautiful copper, which I'm sure they've imagined will age really beautifully, and again, I think demonstrative of their interest in material. They've also gained a reputation for the expertise they have in designing courthouse buildings, including the Federal Courthouse in Orlando and the Taunton Trial Court in Massachusetts. I think this has also been the subject of studios you've done here, which have been rather interesting. And in recognition for this sort of broad and potent contribution, the firm has received over 65 design awards, and in 2007 was awarded the AIA Firm Award, the highest honor the AIA bestows on a firm. Last year, Princeton Architectural Press published a monograph on the firm's work titled Made to Measure, which really captures the quiet, beautiful range of projects and the particular approach of the firm and their preoccupation with place, material, processes of building. Andrea has shared this expertise and her broader engagement with practice very generously in the service she's sort of provided here at the GSD and through her teaching and other engagements like the executive education program. And her presence generally at the school over this last decade has been most appreciated. Her design studios at the GSD have always integrated architecture and urban design, have been spread over many geographies, including Japan, Washington, and most recently her 3-year preoccupation with looking at the condition at the outskirts of Paris. Of course, we all know her French bias and her love for France and the time that she's spent there. And I understand that's what she's going to share with us tonight these experiences, her personal reflections on 10 years of design studios. And in addition to the GSD, she's also taught at Yale, Penn, the University of Virginia, and the Tokyo Institute of Technology. Currently, she is the chair professor at the National Chiao Tung University at Taiwan. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Leers.
Thank you, Rahul, and thank you, my friends and colleagues here who've come after night of lectures this week and a kind of major performance I hear last night. Thank you for taking the time to do that, and thank my partners, Jane and Josiah, who are here, and many colleagues from my office as well who have made possible the work that I do here, truly. Tonight, I want to celebrate the extraordinary, intelligent, and beautiful work of my students, working closely with probably well more than 120 students over these past 10 years, from architecture, urban design, planning, landscape design, probably many more than that. I've learned a great deal from our mutual research and discovery. This talk is a moment to pause and share my perspective on the work here at GSD in these years, and to reflect on the larger arc of ideas that they represent. When I began to think about the sequence of the studios as a whole, and it was a, frankly, fairly daunting task, I recognized a certain persistent methodology of comparative study, or as the French would say, regard croisé. I've always been fascinated by how we define one thing by contrast with another. As an undergraduate at Wellesley College, my major field of study was art history, but in fact my studies were nearly equally divided between art, music, and philosophy, because what really interested me were the correspondences and contrasts between different modes of creative thought. Then when I studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, at the time of Louis Kahn, I was drawn to the foundational pedagogy of the place, that design required thinking at a range of scales, from detail to the city. Later, when I had an NEA fellowship to live in Tokyo and do research there, and subsequent many years of research, those activities then led to other kinds of research in most recent years, spending considerable time in Paris. I acknowledged a lifetime curiosity and passion for understanding our own culture by living in others. So I've brought these personal experiences and perspectives to a very dynamic period at Harvard, the design profession, and the world, from Neil Rudenstein to Drew Faust, from hand drawing to parametric design, from a go-go economy to a recession. These past 10 years have been ones of extraordinary change, and the series of studios mirror those changes. I'd like to just get my mind around the subjects of each of these studios by looking at them in 3 chapters. The years 2001 to 2003, I was teaching as an architecture faculty member, and in architecture, concentrating really on what I would call the tectonic object. These 3 studios will look at, really focused on the making of building a particular individual building. The second group focus on architecture and the city, and really show the way in which considerations of urbanism drove architecture in particular. And then the final cycle, campus as a city itself or as an urban ensemble. Now, when I arrived here a lot before 2001, I think around the time Jorge, if I'm not mistaken, first arrived as a visitor. So I was a visitor for many years over the preceding time from 2001. But when I arrived, there was something going on at the school, and I like to say that it was signaled by this exhibit. This was an exhibit called Immaterial, Ultramaterial, led by Toshiko Mori. It was an intense investigation of several faculty members and students about the subject of material as the substance of an architectural investigation. And It was very much in the air. It informed all of the studios, I think, at the time. I recall Jorge saying, just do a small building. Everybody wants to know how to design a small building. And that's what I did. But the focus was really on the making of those buildings, and the materials that you'll see do reflect that. The first of those studios was a small project for 3 clubhouses, let's say, 3 cultural clubhouses for Trinity College, an Asian American Studies house, Latin American, and a Hillel house for Jewish students. Trinity, which had been a gentleman's school up until the 1970s, finally became a more diverse population and were looking for opportunities to house their students and have those activities shared. And the idea was to have a cluster of these 3 houses on the periphery of the campus, embedded in the neighborhood fabric. So these were the neighborhood houses, and somehow woven into these missing tooth sites at the edge of the campus would be the project. The students investigated a number of ways to think about these 3 houses. Makoto Otake did a wonderful kind of maki-like ensemble of 3 very closely, carefully woven structures together, beautiful little site plan, and always some detailed models. We moved between scales of site scale, of building scale, and that was part of the task. Another student did a series, a beautiful hand sketch here, of 3 houses joined by a common library on the same site, and his model was developed in this way, and he too developed the space, the typical multi-use space of each of these. So you can see the notion of the craft of architecture, the making of spaces as essential. These were all individual student projects. At this time, this was only offered in architecture, although, of course, other students could take the courses. The second of these studios in 2002 was precedent to our own work at the then Hasty Pudding Club. The club had been taken over by Harvard, had started, as you know, as a gentleman's club long ago, and had become famous for its theatrical performances right there at the heart of Harvard Square. And the club had originated in the 1880s from the profits of the theatricals, very popular source. Our task then was to reimagine a full undergraduate student theater for this site, and unlike what we were finally able to do, we imagined away the present building. It was of marginal, shall we say, historic value, and we didn't get involved in the protests that would have erupted in Harvard Square if this really happened, but using the whole site. And what you can see is a very big program in a very tight site. That was true even later when we got to deal with it. But this student, Sebastian Schmeling, who, by the way, was honored to be one of the New York young architects, promising, has a practice in Milwaukee, did a wonderful embedded theater with a kind of promenade or procession up through the building with an outdoor theater on the rooftop. So it was both an inside theater and an outside theater, tremendously inventive, developed every space in the building, did many, many studies of the theater space itself, and lots of wonderful studies of the enclosure and the front facade, thinking about how it would engage the public. And there's somebody we know studying that model in a final review. The third of these early studios was something actually cooked up in conspiracy with Mark Mulligan. My long-standing interest in Japan found its way into this studio, and we invented a studio seminar tandem together with a site study tour. And the idea of the studio was, the subject of the design studio was a New Japan Society building in a site in Boston. Our notion was in parallel with Mark's Modern Japanese Architecture seminar, we would together investigate the culture, the building culture of Japan, and see how that might be translated in our building here in Boston. We took 14 students on a 14-day trip to Japan. It was whirlwind, it was exhausting. These are some of the subjects studied in Mark's course. There we all are. Managing 14 people around Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto was a task in itself. I asked all the students to do site drawings, not just take photos. This of Shisendo, beautiful garden, and Entsuji, one of the famous borrowed view gardens. People made caricatures. This is the Horyuji Treasures Museum of Taniguchi, recently finished, and the Church of the Light in Tokyo, which Mark was very involved in, and a little sketch of Maki. So the model for our subject was the Japan Society of New York, designed in the 70s by Junzo Yoshimura, one of the great early mid-century modernists. And our sites, for comparison, were in Boston, one on Commonwealth Avenue, where there's a small park, and another right downtown in the heart of the financial district, right on Milk Street, right at the prow of that site there, so that we could look at the difference between doing this in a big open site and a narrow, tight site. Some of the projects were this on the Commonwealth Avenue site, this by Hui Min, who had worked with Taniguchi, and I think you can see the evidence of that in her composition. This was a gallery, a garden, a learning center, and an auditorium kind of program. Closer study, very lovely project. And another student who admired what we saw of Maki's work in Tokyo did a screened enclosure with a series of terraced gardens inside. Now, in this period, we did many physical models. We did them at all scales, at site scale, at building detail scale. Another project, this on the downtown site, on the very narrow site, by Tiffany Lin, now on the faculty at Tulane, was a much different kind of arrangement. This a vertical project. Tiffany also did a study of a room in its garden. And what's this? Hand drawings, actual plans and sections drawn by hand right there. And also physical models, the auditorium, the kind of figural presence, and offices, and the education center, the garden on the inside. Well, that period was one of, as I said, intense concentration on the tectonic and material qualities of an individual building or small ensemble. But around somewhere between 2003 and 2006, I'm going to say, a whole new kind of set of issues came to the foreground, and I see them in the exhibits and in the publications of that time. Certainly, the issue of urbanism rose to the fore in a very prominent way. Our own Felipe and Joan Busquets' City's 10 Lines was an important step in that. There was the MoMA show called Groundswell, which really, for the first time, I think, showcased the interrelationship between ground studies, building studies, infrastructure studies. And then there was I would say, the intellectual underpinnings for discussions that had been going on for a very long time about the uses of digital computation in design and representation. The exhibit at the Pompidou, Architecture non-standard, non-standard architecture, was spoken about here at Harvard in a lecture by the curator of that show, Frédéric Miguerou, who not only put some intellectual legs under the work that was just beginning to emerge, but also did a lot of work in looking at what the precedents might be for that work, and identified a series of themes like inflections and ribbons and bending and so forth that were characteristic of the work, and saw the origins of that in work of the 60s and 70s, if not before. And that led to the next cycle of studies, which had very much to do with architecture and the city. It was the first time that there was quite an emphasis on multidisciplinary studios, and this was actually a period in which I did studios offered in both architecture and urbanism. The first of these was a studio on Washington's southwest waterfront. Toshiko and Alex Krieger had come to me to see whether I might be interested in doing this studio. I had not taught urban design studios before that, but I thought this was a moment to learn. It was timely, and immersed myself. It was one of the very few multidisciplinary studios that was offered at that time, and frankly, for some time after that. It's become much more common today. So it was something of an experiment. Tony Griffin, now on the faculty, was at that time at Anacostia Waterfront Development Corporation. She acted as our client. And the idea was to study this area. Here's the mall in Washington, the capital, to get oriented. To study this area of the waterfront, which was under study for development, major development, riverfront, mixed use, housing, hotel, commercial, and so forth. The idea was to look at this area. We investigated a very interesting area, had been cleared in the 1960s in the single largest urban renewal effort in this country. And it was because it was in sight of the Capitol, and the Congress thought it unsightly to have the likes of these kinds of spaces, beautifully photographed by Gordon Parks, for example, so near to the Capitol, and huge area was demolished for the rebuilding. The rebuilding involved a major link between the mall and almost the waterfront called the 10th Street Mall, designed by I.M. Pei with the developer Zeckendorf. Lots of new buildings along there, but jumping over the highway, as you can see here, but stopping short and higher than the waterfront itself. The more interesting part of the urban renewal was a great deal of mid-century experiment in housing, low and mid-rise and high-rise housing. The area then, here was the groups of housing that were developed. What we looked at was Charles Goodman, very, very beautiful project. And then what was a kind of parking lot, very informal edge, ready for some kind of redevelopment. So it was in this studio that for the first time we were really engaging ourselves in urban analysis. We went to Washington, of course, and met with the mayors and the developers of these areas. And out of that grew an interesting range of proposals. This one, for example, was a kind of continuous building, a thread of buildings that wove along the waterfront, creating inner spaces and waterfront edge spaces. Very complex, but really the idea of a continuous building along the waterfront. And quite another approach was this one of Yoshi Mishima. Some of you may remember Yoshi. He was a student in landscape who had been an architect before, and his idea about the edge was to return it to its riparian origins and to recreate a natural landscape and have all the buildings as a background to it, and did an enormous number of studies in what the natural condition might have been like. It was really like a reimagined landscape. And then the building itself, the buildings of housing and hotel and so forth, less developed, but the notion being that they were background buildings, and then periodically there would be pavilions out in the park. So clearly a big, broad range of looking at what that waterfront condition might be. The second of these architecture in the city studios was something closer to my heart, something I felt I already knew something about rather than having to learn all about it. And this was the proposal at the time for a new central courthouse for Paris. There was a competition that was being announced. The site was at the very center of Paris on the left bank in one of the former industrial areas adjacent to the train tracks, but was interesting as the investigation of a modern monumentality. France had built a lot of these, as you know, and a few of these, and they were really in a period of thinking carefully about what a symbolism for modern civic life might be. And a whole set of new courthouses were being created, so that was the context. The Paris courthouse was right here, the site right here along the river, okay, Notre Dame over here. And just behind the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Perot award-winning scheme for that. Here are the railroad tracks coming out of Austerlitz. And also on the site was this swath right here. On the site was an historic industrial hall to be kept if possible. Kind of devilishly hard, and eventually the site was abandoned, I should say wisely. So here's the library up on a deck, the train tracks, the hall, the section of all of that. Somewhere in here was meant to be a courthouse of national significance. That was the hall. The hall was indeed a beautiful thing. So we began in earnest with some very good and very exhaustive studies of different aspects of the urban condition in the city. Here was our site right here, major circulation, population densities, commercial activity, the metro system. We also did a lot of looking at dimensions and characteristics of public spaces around Paris, because we knew we would have to create some kind of setting for that. We looked at the program, which I will simply say that the green stuff is all of the public spaces and the courtrooms, and all the blue stuff are offices. So what we're talking about is an enormous office building with some courthouses at the bottom. And the responses of the students were really varied, really interesting. David Austin proposed the unthinkable in a very tall tower, taller than the Eiffel Tower, to have all the offices in, and then a 7-story base zone with all the courthouses, so that it would fit just on this little sliver of site next to the hall, the Great Hall, and then the hall would become a marketplace. Kind of an interesting and provocative notion. James Karst did just the opposite. He decided on a low, flat, mat building and created a big courtyard in the center. It was his larger vision for the area, was a series of courtyard structures. And because it was a big mat building, there had to be lots of little sliver courtyard light wells, and he developed that quite completely, right down to the scale of building and courtroom, both using, I should say, you're seeing now some digital representations coming in, side by side with some physical modeling. This was quite a beautiful project. Mihei did another thing, very, very interesting as well. She left the hall, which would then be converted for all of the courtrooms, and flanked that with 2 long office bars and connected those across at key points, did a very, very fine analysis of the frequency of cross services, cores. It was almost like a musical score. It was a very, very beautiful study and a very beautiful project. And here's her view of the courtrooms in the old industrial hall and the offices flanking either side. And the third in this trio of mid-group studios was again following my interest to Tokyo. Here again, thinking to build on some of the work that we had done earlier here at school, and again looking at a neighborhood in the city. Here, we looked at this in conjunction with a studio at Meiji University, the neighborhood of Jimbocho, which let's see if I can show you that. That's just Tokyo in general. The neighborhood of Jimbocho, very close to the very center, the heart of the city. Right here in the old part of the city was the University Quarter and became the book quarter, the selling of antique books and the production of new books. A very interesting area. Once just a very intimate village-like character, had become busier, but also had retained that quality. So the idea was really, we were working within a neighborhood process. We met with representatives there to look at what parts of this fabric, largely in this area, wanted to be preserved and enhanced, and what parts, where were there opportunities for growth, because the area, of course, is under tremendous pressure for redevelopment, and like lots of parts of Paris. And so we identified two sites, one here at the crossing of the major way down from subway system, the major street through, and its cross street. So one at that juncture, and one a more infill site on this cross street that would be more typical of buildings that might be built. So one was a one-off, the other was a kind of typical. And this model is only slightly less jumbled than the actual fabric of the city. It was, here's that triangular site, here's the main boulevard and the cross avenue. And students began to look at opportunities for insertions, missing teeth blocks, building on spaces that provided opportunities. So they were looking for places to build in this city fabric. Two students joined forces, and we saw this increasingly. This was a choice. I didn't insist, but it was a choice for students to do work in teams, in pairs, or not. In this case, I actually thought maybe the teams would work on the area plan and individuals would develop the building within. This pair liked working together a lot, and they thought they would go on to develop the infill site, Publishers Building, we called it, a little office building with some exhibit areas. And they started out with two separate models, and they converged and made a project which is really very inventive and could well stand for a project in the context as a type. The lower 3 or 4 floors were galleries and retail spaces and public areas. The middle sections were the offices for rental for startup publishers, and then at the top of the building, some shared spaces and libraries. And they went on to develop this quite thoroughly. And here you can see, I think, in their model, the lower public portions of the building and then the upper portions interwoven with shared spaces. The fact that they worked together on this one building, I think, made it possible for them to go quite far with it. The other site, the triangular site, really was suitable for a big mixed-use complex. It was, the program for that was residences, hotel, and a big information center with some public functions. And Stephen Gray did a kind of big city, this is on the main boulevard, signal building at that corner site, and worked both digitally and in physical model to develop the kind of open corner that he was after and the tower above it. He built up his program. It was a very complex, big program from the retail areas to the public areas to the hotel with its lobby to the housing. Developed that quite thoroughly and made a number of terrific models. Other students looked at the opportunities to gather in their planning areas, to gather new building around certain important intersections, and then went on to develop the site right here. With that in mind, Caitlin Swain and Margaret Swanson did the joint studies, and this was Caitlin's individual building. Quite a beautiful piece of work, which also had those public spaces below and the offices above. And Caitlin developed a kind of continuous ramping exhibit kind of space at the lower levels that finally resolved itself on the regular floors above, and made some beautiful models as well. We all visited Mr. Mackey's office, had dinner together. He gathered all of the Harvard graduates from the later, his time, and around his time to go out for dinner and to celebrate. Well, that was chapter 2. Before we get to chapter 3, just a couple of moments of emphasis, or moments that I find kind of important to symbolize what was in the air or in the water, or on the ground in this case. Charles Waldheim's Landscape Urbanism Reader came out in 2006. It was a moment where we were all thinking about the investigation of larger territories. And back in Paris, there was a broad look. This was a national initiative to look at Paris as a greater metropolitan region, which had not been done in a number of years. There was a series, probably you all know by now, 10 invited teams, of which Joan Busquets was one of those members. Different proposals for the notion of growing Paris. Port-Saint-Parc, instead of having what he called the oil stain of rippling out, or the satellite city, thought of something like a rhizome or a potato sending up sprouts in different places. That was his metaphor. The Grumbach group, which included Professor Busquets, imagined the city from Paris all the way to Le Havre along the river, a city along the river Seine. And MVRDV imagined all of the growth that Paris might want in a big block hovering over the city, and tested out several strategies about how it might grow around the periphery, scattered throughout, and so forth. So they were speculations, but the point was thinking beyond the immediate known world of defined spaces. And that led me to think about, I'd followed that consultation fairly closely, and that led me to think about the idea of a related set of studios which might be of interest here. And what I learned was, at the same time, one of the outgrowths of that larger metropolitan Paris look was a very ambitious national program for the expansion of universities outside the city. The city of Paris had been ringed in politically, physically, a long time, and all of the schools within it needed space. And this was a national initiative to develop several right around Paris, but all over the country, new universities or renovated universities. There was an exhibit, a national exhibit. There's the president himself. There's the Ministry of Education, Minister of Education, Valérie Pécresse, who's now Ministry of Finance, I think, isn't she? Or she's been moved to another ministry. But lots of investigation and public discussion about the need for that. Now, this was a time when Moysen was very much encouraging research to be part of studios, or at least not the hermetic separation between studio and coursework. Mark and I had already experimented with that some time ago, but I began to think about that, and Antoine was key in helping me make some key connections with government people, academic, and so forth, and devised together with Neil Levine a seminar on the development of metropolitan Paris in conjunction with the studio, in parallel, I should say, with the studio. And most of the students of the studio took that course as well and did various research projects within it. So the first of the studios centered on a proposal for a new campus just outside the bounds of the city, just to remember how the figure of the city and how over time in 1860 there was an actual walled city that became ringed by a zone of combined open space and housing. By 1909, today it's ringed by an elevated highway, and the barriers remain. So the sealedness of the city it was very much a fact. Our site that we were looking at was on the northern edge of the city. This is really just a tracking of all of the efforts around the periphery to bridge that gap. This had been going on for at least 20 years before this time. But here you can see how very near our studio was. This is the Stade de France, the big national stadium for soccer, right up here. And this is the actual line of the elevated highway around, right at the edge of that and about to be connected by the metro. The site is a declining industrial area with some structures that have been recaptured. This is the Saint-Gobain Glass Company headquarters here, right in this area. But you can see from the aerial the grain of big structures, mostly in very poor condition. The site edge is bounded by the Canal Saint-Denis, which is still today even a working canal, increasingly recreational. And on this side, the major autoroute north. Between the canal and the autoroute, by the way, is maybe a 15, 20-minute walk. We're not talking about a big area. And the campus was right in the middle. These are just a reminder about the limited and crowded conditions of the universities inside Paris. What happened here was that 12 different elements of either the University of Paris or some graduate schools came together around the social sciences to decide to make a campus together. This is actually going forward, I should say. They had a little program. It was very rough. It was, the white bar represents all the research offices they wanted, and the rest, all the little white stuff, was all the rest they didn't think they needed. This would have been an office park if it were built this way, and we actually imagined all of the rest of campus life that might be needed, and that was the program we worked with. We worked at city scale, thinking about how the intervention here might actually work with transport, with existing parkways. In this study by Sarah and Ming, a landscape architect and architecture student, looked at all the ways through the campus, some of the natural patterns, the green patterns, and developed a north-south linear campus with an inner campus route through here, quite a lot of open space, and a public tramway route along here, and then a cross street that would go canal to highway with the library and a plaza in the middle. And their proposal really reflected both of their interests. There was a lot of development around this plaza area, but what you see here are some working planted fields, and here the first part of a study for the library and some of the major buildings that surrounded that main space. Another team of students looked at an east-west campus and were inspired by the matrix kind of campus that Jussieu is in downtown Paris. They looked at a grid that gradually became warped by local conditions and eroded to make up the campus fabric. It was a very interesting study, and developed a low campus, more or less four-story campus, continuous, with around a main space where the metro would arrive, with library and key things around, and then other graduate schools and offices around that. Developed together the library space and the main plaza, and actually got into building scale. Yet another group did something very interesting. They imagined also a north-south campus, but centered it around a terrace, which was itself the roof of the main library. All of the offices were on one side, all of the student activities, cafeteria, gymnasium on the other, and created a very compact, very interesting notion of a terrace campus around the library, on top of the library, with passage through and so forth. So it was a very interesting and compact proposal, quite developed in their studies of how the library would be underground, 3 stories, and what the surface would be like. Again, studied in many different media. This was 2 architecture students who were really tremendously talented. And there we all are, the plaza. The second studio was on a site more remote from Paris, but also a terribly important area. This is in the area of Versailles here. This is called the Saclay Plateau, and it is presently largely an agricultural plateau with some important science installations on it. And it is the site, the hoped-for site, of the new concentration of science, research, and technology at a national scale. And it's about 35 minutes by metro to this location, which is below the plateau, and then you have the challenge of getting up onto the plateau, which looks like this. It is amazing space. It was created along with the creation of Versailles, effectively drained and used as a water source for the waterworks at Versailles. So it was a created landscape with channels and viaducts, and really an amazing place. And now a very fertile landscape, although a very shallow soil condition. It is, and we began with a number of studies of this, the agricultural patterns, the water patterns today as they still exist. Many of the channels and viaducts are still there. Some slope analysis where you can see all of the development, and that's the red part, is all down at the foot of the plateau with spotty installations above. There are some major research institutes, and some of the science university, Paris-Orsay, are up there, as well as the École Polytechnique, which Antoine knows well, all too well. The studies, our studies this semester, and I should say, in this semester, Antoine was not giving his parallel course, so we brought the research unit into the studio. We did papers as well as buildings on some very interesting subjects. This study, we looked at this cluster area of the plateau, and the notion was that the science university on the lower slopes and at the bottom of the hill would be relocated to a more dense and coordinated university campus above, incorporating the few buildings that already existed there. We also imagined, because this was prior to any of the study that had really been done systematically on the plateau. We also imagined future installations and future campuses, which this one near the École Polytechnique and in between. So it was a very large territory, in fact, very hard to kind of understand and get our hands around. And Etienne and Jennifer, both architect and landscape architect, devised a very compact university around a central square, a very clear figure for the main buildings, outbuildings, research buildings, and so forth. Existing buildings are in gray. So there was a real focus, and the square itself was a raised platform under which the metro would arrive, the cars would park, and so forth. Investigated that in some detail so that the library and all the key functions were around, and then this kind of sunken plaza which opened up to the lower level. Jonathan Schelse and Ilana Cohn, and Masters of Urban Design and Landscape Architecture pair, did something which they called a forestation urbanism, and thought about the very radical notion of developing all the periphery of the plateau with a grid of forestation of trees, among which one would find the campus itself and other developments. Their notion had to do with bringing the forest of the edges up onto the plateau, sometimes in agricultural ways, sometimes with small building density, sometimes with bigger, and some still bigger, like a campus. So there was a gradation of density within this system, and their campus was something like this, with major crossroads within a grid. So it was really a gridded system, the grid having more or less trees in it, or more or less buildings. They did quite a lot of study of the open spaces of the campus, and then developed the library building in some detail. And here was a view of that open space at the center, the treed space, the bosque at the center of the campus. We were inspired at Versailles. And then finally, this most recent studio, and I should thank Felipe Bermudez, who's here. He was the TA for that studio and helped me put this together. In this final studio, we were able to continue work on the Saclay Plateau in the area of the École Polytechnique, down at this end. The previous site had been here. By this time, in the intervening year, the planning agency for this development had engaged a team headed by Michel de Vigne to do an overall assessment of the plateau and potential for development. And he developed a kind of gridded system that would run, that would shift a little bit and angled, that would run as a framework for all of the development, which he proposed to be concentrated on the southern edge. We had, in fact, concluded that ourselves, that made a great deal of sense. We were really happy that he agreed with us. And this became then a framework. It was quite developed in place for the next campus, which was to be a group of graduate schools anchored by the Polytechnique here, and high-tech companies. And so this was really kind of imagined as a mixed academic and research and commercial campus. Again, we started looking now with a little more information at hand on transportation routes. There was more known about the route, the probable route of what probably would be a surface transit, light transit, a bus or some sort of tram. There was more known about that. We continued studies of campus prototypes. We had done that in each of the preceding studios, so we were able to see we were able to really build a knowledge or a kind of vocabulary for campuses and superimposed them over the site so that we could begin to get a feel for, in this vast plateau, how a campus might feel. We looked at some of the components and the possibilities of gathering the engineering parts of the program together with the Polytechnique and some of the food and energy researches together and information technologies together and so forth. And Felipe and his partner Ruth Siegel, again, urban design and landscape partners, conceived of a double lobe, or bow tie, I guess we called it, strategy for dealing with the site in which the Polytechnique would be one center and the School of Agronomy would be the other center, and placed in the larger campus, the plateau area, together with its routes, were thought about. And this figure then would be ringed by the public transit with stops right here at the pinch point, which would be the main campus green. And that was developed in this way, with most of the new buildings along the center zone of that green, and the principal library and learning center, as it was called, would be flanking the green. And together, Ruth and Felipe worked both on the landscape and the principal building surrounding that. And we can see that here. Ricardo and Ben, Ricardo's here tonight, I think. Yep, there he is. Two architects had a rather architectural conception, I should say, of how the campus might be, and developed a very dense internal spine around the Polytechnique, found ways to link across here, and then at a crossing made their central space flanked by the two principal buildings of the area, the recreational and the learning and library. So developed a kind of strategy, again, with two centers and a joined green space, linked by both a formal space and a more irregular and relaxed space. And in one of the most interesting experiences I've had teaching, these two students work together to figure out what two separate buildings might make a good center space with the kind of porosity that each wanted. And so they did a number of studies to look at how dense, how open, how configured, as though each were influencing the other in those individual buildings. And their result then was a recreation, theater, gymnasium, movie complex on one side that was volumetric and transparent through, and then a more fluid and continuous library learning center on the other. Ben went on to look at some of the fabric of the enclosure of the theater space, and Ricardo looked at the puzzle of a winding, rising, ramped arrangement of learning spaces. But their real concern was what the place was like that the two buildings shaped, and I think was very interesting in that regard. Then there were our two folks from Beijing, who one was an urban designer and one was a MArch2 student, who threw over the traces of the Michel de Vigne grid plan altogether and developed an extraordinary kind of chevron-shaped open space which divided the program precincts into three areas, which suited the program quite well, and linked the natural condition of the open fields at this end and a lake opposite the Polytechnique on this end quite well, as a strategy. Came very early in a hand sketch. It was quite interesting how that idea developed, and was developed in a very interesting way. So each of these quadrants had a major institutional player, allowed them their identity as well as there being a community around this open space, and then all of the shared facilities, the learning center, the library, the athletics, were in a kind of continuous building form along that edge between the center and the lake. And they studied that plan in some detail, moving from the learning center, the lecture halls, through exhibit areas, through athletic spaces, and getting finally all the way to the lake and looking back here. And the obligatory group photo at the end. So, what trajectory can we discern from this mad dash through 10 years? In the early studios, the crafted, nuanced individual building was the central concern. Sites and subjects were local. Hand drawings and physical models were the tools of investigation, and students worked individually. In the middle group of studios, the thrust of investigating the dynamic, site-specific, and complex relationships between architecture and the city became dominant. The urbanist framework drove design strategies. And in this period, sites and subjects were global. Digital representation was used side by side with physical modeling, and students began to learn the benefit of working in teams. Then in the most recent trio of studios, we were able to sequentially build a body of research on the subject of the campus and on the sites, and give consideration to the interweaving of architecture, urban design, and landscape in the creation of a city-like community. The sites and subjects were focused on a single region and type, and we came to understand that context more fully due to the repeated cycle of studios. Tools of the study were predominantly digital, and students found the partnering of individuals from different disciplines essential. So clearly, the trajectory shows a steady movement toward urbanism, stewardship of and strategies for natural systems, and digitally enabled design. This trajectory will require more collaborative work, more research, and more flexible formats beyond the standalone one semester, one studio. But even as we're swept along by the currents of change, I do want to raise two cautions. First, the GSD must not forget the obligation of a great institution to give back to the community it resides in. The visions and research generated here should be turned to the local as well as the global. And second, we must not forget our obligation to teach students the art of building well, to craft environments which empower, delight, and uplift human life and society. And I just want to finish with a film that one of the students from the second Beyond Paris studio made after the fact, James Wilford, and it's just a beautiful encapsulation of all of this.
few questions? Can I take a few questions? So we have a few minutes for questions.
I should have said, by the way, that last project was the joint work of James Wilford and Jonathan Linkus.
So was the Paris work shown there, and how was it received?
Yes, those, the Paris work was seen after each studio. I did go back and make a presentation of the results, but there was also a public lecture after the first studio, which is finally just about to go forward, actually. They're beginning to put out RFPs. But I did do a public lecture on the idea of the campus and the city, and talked a little bit about the general idea of that, but also used a number of the student projects as a way to demonstrate the possibilities. So yeah, there was a lot of interest, and in that exhibit that we had a picture of, one of our student projects was included. This was an exhibit of the 12 different campuses that were being examined by different schools of architecture, all in France except ours. So we represented that site. So that was pretty exciting. So. Any thoughts from Ricardo or Felipe, who are
I'm not an architect, but it was absolutely fascinating. And you don't have to be an architect to enjoy such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Elliot, yeah.
Deal with the street-level life and the activities in any of the projects? Andrea, did your students deal with the activity at the ground plane, how the students interacted, what spaces they created? You showed some spaces, but I didn't see crowds of people. I wasn't quite sure where the people were being generated.
That certainly varied from subject to subject. For example, in the Tokyo Book City studio, it was all about the street life because there were so many people on the street that all of the designs were generated by what it would be like to walk there, how would you create some open space, how would you move into the building and up through the building. I'll have to say in the campus projects, the task of getting our arms around a strategy for an entire campus in a really hard to fathom setting was pretty all-consuming. And only occasionally did people actually get down on the ground and imagine what it was like to be moving between spaces. We'd really tried, and in every one of the studios, I think, I didn't dwell on it, but I do, as a matter of my own way of thinking about design, move from one scale to another. That is, the scale of the site and its larger strategy as against the scale of the individual building or place adjacent to the building or street formed by two buildings. Moving between those scales is, I think, is an essential part of design in this kind of continuum. And even in the small buildings, we moved between whole building and its site massing and all that, and the fabric of building as it was made and the spaces it created. But it was really hard to get to in the last three studios because the figuring out what a campus was, what it might be in such a setting, how it was different from campuses as we know them here, all of that was a lot of work. I mean, it might have benefited from a more extended period of a lot of research for one semester and then the beginnings of design in another. That's what I mean when I say it's the one semester, one studio format is limited. The cycle of 3 was actually very useful. We got better at it. We actually knew more when we started the 3rd.
Final Paris Studios, was there a lot of housing incorporated in with the campuses, or you said initially that they didn't start out wanting to do that, and I wondered, it wasn't easy to tell in the projects how much of it might be housing or how the housing was related.
I didn't point out what was what in all of these. There was just more detail than I think I could say, but there was not a lot of housing. We had a lot of discussion about that because, of course, our notion, the American notion of campus, is a living place. It's a community with all the parts of community in it, and there was a lot of debate about that in the French setting, because the notion, the embedded notion, is a university quarter within the city, which is completely integrated with the city, and you go home to sleep and come back for classes and eat and study in the local cafes and so forth. It's not a campus as such. Yet there was a kind of yearning that we discerned for that kind of leafy green precinct of campus in the American way that kept coming back, and we did try to find a balance. Housing was part of that discussion. There was some housing, most in the first studio. The housing was intended to be dispersed through the adjacent community, nearby, but part of the community integrated. Once we got out to Saclay, it really had to either be put there, or we had to assume that people went elsewhere and home to go to sleep. So it was the program itself, as they developed it, was a little half-hearted in that regard. Housing was not very developed as a component of the campus, though we knew that it probably had to be, especially so isolated. So there was a lot of discussion. We even had one presentation which there was a class, I guess they must have been planners, who came to attend our presentation. And several of the students said, well, I wouldn't want to live on campus. You know, that's too confining. I want my freedom. I want to be able to go home and go out when I want to in the evening. And they saw living within a campus, some of them, as a limitation, as much through cultural habit, probably, as anything else. But it was not a clear a mandate, I should say, about whether there should be a important residential component of these campuses. And the housing tended to be peripheral in the campuses that we developed, building on the housing that was already there. So we did not investigate an absolutely woven together fabric of housing and academic buildings, like we might here in this country.
Yeah, I'm interested in your attitude toward the relation of old and new in all of these contexts, which of course were very different. But there were an awful lot of building within established contexts, which you must have been very aware of. And I wondered what your reflections were, because the use of the models, of course, is such a marvelously anonymous tool when you're really solving a problem. But sooner or later, that has to be envisioned as something that's next to something else, or as part of a neighborhood of a certain scale. And what were your reflections on that? And were yours any different from those of the other, in those cases where you were working with other French groups? Were they different?
I would just say, beyond even the French studios, that was an issue that varied enormously. For example, in the Southwest Washington studio, we had, the context was a 1960s urban renewal fabric. That was what was there, and we actually were inspired by the best of it and appalled by the worst of it, you know, and that was the context. In the Tokyo studio, Tokyo Books studio, we were trying desperately to preserve parts of a context that developers were ready to get rid of. they were ready to demolish the whole area and build, you know, big new development buildings through the whole thing. And our focus was on what were those parts which gave the area its character and should be repaired, restored, kept, and where were the opportunities for building new. So that was another case. In the case of the first Paris studio, we were in an industrial area where there was no street system. There was very little valuable we looked hard for good warehouses to reuse because that was exciting. But there was fairly little industrial fabric that we could really build on. Some parts of it we could. What instead we focused on was the larger infrastructure, the canal, the main north-south dividers, the possibilities of moving east-west across the sites. So in each case, I think we tried, at least, I don't know if we were successful, but we tried to immerse ourselves in that context and understand what the challenge was. Sometimes it was preserve, sometimes it was really reinvent. In Saclay, the context was 1970s and beyond. There was a little tiny bit of extant 19th century building, very far dispersed kind of farm structures, village structures, but very vast nuclear research complexes built in the 60s and 70s. So it was very hard to, there was no one answer to that, Jane. It was really trying to immerse ourselves in each context and understand what it asked for.
Thank you very much.
Okay.